Hey, hi everybody. This is weird because I am going to try to pay attention to my screen, but also to the people who are here in the audience as well. This will be a new experience for me. So I appreciate your patience as I try to navigate this kind of social experiment. um, I just wanted to begin by thanking the Museum for Art in Wood and NextFab for having me for the winter residency this year. It's been a really amazing experience to get to spend time just on wood and focusing on a project that I have been imagining doing for a few years, for maybe even a decade. Um, and this kind of gave me the time and the space to just do that. I am a metalsmith in addition to being a wood carver, so my time is kind of equally split between making adornment work and also trying to make sculptural woodwork. So this was a really nice time for me, and I really appreciate it. Um, I'm gonna jump into my presentation, uh, and all these Zoom commands gonna get in the way. Hang on. We're gonna do it that way. Okay. So through this presentation, I'll introduce you to my work and my journey, and kind of what it took for me to get to the place that I am in today. I'd like to share not only artwork that I've made, but also my service work through curation and community service, and also the things that I had to do outside of art to make all of this work financially and like fiscally. So I think that that's kind of an important thing that I like to share with people. The journey is not always straight and narrow. Um, so to kind of start things off, let's begin with where I grew up. I grew up in Boise, Idaho, which is a really nice small city in southern Idaho. Um, there are lots of amenities there, but also a lot of nature. And I spent a lot of my time in the trails, kind of exploring the landscape there. And you would often see beautiful scenery and different animals, which is something that I really came to appreciate and incorporate into my practice. Some of the animals that you might see include red-tailed hawks perched up high in trees. Um, at other times, you might find something a little bit more frightening, such as a rattlesnake in the sagebrush. But perhaps most frightening of all, you might see Mormons as well. Lots and lots of Mormons. So a lot of my story actually has to do with growing up in the Mormon church as a gay individual. And that was kind of hard for me, having that kind of conservative background and trying to find myself within that environment. Now I know what everybody is thinking, so we should just get it out of the way and out into the open. Yes, Mormons do wear magic underwear. That is accurate and true. Um, but kind of all joking aside, that upbringing really did influence a lot of the work that I had been making. And something over the years that I've actually kind of been getting tired of talking about is my Mormon upbringing. And I would really like to leave that behind and really focus on the future and something different. But this talk is not going to do that. I will still be talking about that today. Um, in addition to growing up in a conservative family, I also grew up in a hunting family. So a lot of the kind of daily visual lexicon that influenced my worldview were these animal trophies that were hunted by my dad. And it was kind of like a daily reminder of the type of masculine individual I was meant to become. But instead of hunting bears like these, I ended up hunting bears like these instead. And so a lot of my work is about finding community and exploring identity and the body. Um, but I know we all came here to see some art, so let's begin kind of at the beginning of that as well. Um, we'll begin with this, one of the earliest documents that I have of my creative practice. My mom sent this to me a couple of months ago, sort of as a reminder of where I came from. I guess this is supposed to be a mermaid, it says. But in addition to being a two-dimensional artist, I was also a prolific three-dimensional artist as well. So my creative roots kind of run deep. Um, so kind of growing up with, a somewhat supportive family in terms of the art stuff that I was doing, I ended up selecting Boise State University um, for undergrad and kind of fell into art. I wasn't really sure what to do, and I explored a lot of different majors before I decided that art was the direction I wanted to go in. And I actually majored in sculpture and painting. I didn't get my metalsmithing background until a little bit later. Um, but while I was doing that, that kind of became the bedrock for the ideas of masculinity and gender and that sort of thing that I was playing with. So here is this kind of textile bear that I had sculpted and made the pattern for. Um, that piece and this piece were also in my senior capstone exhibition. And so I was kind of playing around with embroidery and the idea of domestic history and materials. Um, and while I was doing all of that, I was taking a lot of metals classes and sculpture classes where I discovered the art of wood carving. Um, I had one instructor who sort of introduced me to wood carving, but was not really a wood carver herself. So I ended up kind of becoming self-taught. So a lot of the wood carving that I do today all sort of stemmed from doing individual research and buying books and watching YouTube videos and really trying to teach myself the art of wood. Um, so it was kind of a long journey. I graduated. I moved to Seattle with my partner Everett. And I kind of felt like, okay, I've got my degree. I'm gonna start my artistic life. I ended up working for actually probably 5 or 6 different jewelers while I was there, but these were my 3 main employers, Deanna, Aaron, and Iris. Um, and I had a really great 3 years with each of them, learning about their trade and their skills and their expertise in business. And I was really kind of feeling like, yes, I've figured it out. I'm like just going to do art. I had a studio and we shared that in the international district, and it was a really amazing experience. But then the bills come, and then I had to kind of work through the reality that their employment is not always constant when you're an independent contractor working for artists. And so while I was doing a lot of that work and I was making my own work, I was also working for a number of different food places. I worked at a really wonderful French bakery called Bakery Nouveau. And that's kind of the reality, I think, of like trying to start a career in art. It often takes you a few different times, a few different tries to really figure things out and to make it work. Um, but while I was doing that, I was also volunteering and getting really involved in my community. And that was actually, I think, one of the first times that Nava and I had like a professional interaction together, besides when I worked at the Bellevue Art Museum. But I ran the Seattle Metals Guild lecture series committee with Everett. We were co-chairing that. And that gave me an opportunity to really connect with my community and feel like I was really involved. We also began our curatorial practice there, and our very first exhibition was held at a friend's house during the Seattle Metals Guild Symposium in 2015, I think it was. And that was a really good experience and kind of like became a constant for us. We continue to do exhibitions today, and I'll kind of talk about some of those. So some of the work that I was doing post undergrad, I was focusing on metalsmithing and really trying to learn how to be a jeweler. But I also really wanted to develop my wood carving skills as well. So I spent a lot of time trying to combine the woodwork that I was doing with adornment work. Often I was working a little bit sculptural. So this piece is articulated and it's like this fish finger thing. I'm a lot of the time I'm making work and I'm not really exactly sure what the ideas are, and I just sort of like follow the creation intuitively. Um, I was kind of experimenting with different forms, really trying to hone in my carving abilities. So I'd often work small and fast, or as fast as I could, because my studio time was really limited. Um, and while I was doing all of the jewelry work, I was also trying to work a little more sculpturally as well. I kind of um I kind of had this sort of like war going on in my brain about whether or not I wanted to be a jeweler or whether or not I wanted to be a sculptor. And I had a really hard time deciding which path I should go down. And so like I made this bust and I was feeling pretty good about it and thinking like this is it. This I'm going to be a sculptor because I have this ability. I've developed these carving skills. This is what I'm passionate about. Um but then I went to the Society for North American Goldsmiths Conference in Boston in 2015 and really started to feel this camaraderie with the jewelry community that I had not felt before. I made a lot of connections there and was really inspired by the talks that I had seen. And after getting home and really thinking about it, decided that I would pursue jewelry instead. So I took the bust that I had made and decided to cut it up into a bunch of smaller pieces and use traditional jewelry settings to make them wearable. So I call this my wooden bust series or fragment series. And each piece was kind of set in different creative ways to either be pendants or rings. And I think I had a few earrings as well in that series. And that was sort of like me saying that I was making a commitment to being a jeweler. I was sort of like getting rid of the sculpture part of myself and committing to that path instead. Um, so after I'd made that series, I decided to apply and go to grad school. I ended up going to East Carolina University, um, where I really wanted to dive into more heavy research. So when I first got there, I decided to kind of focus on um, sort of like secret means for communication. And I was looking at the lover's eye brooch. As the story goes with lover's eye brooches, the Prince of Wales had sort of like this secret lover that he was not allowed to be with. And to sort of commemorate their love, their forbidden longing for each other, they each had miniature portraits made of their eyes that they would each wear. So they could have this sort of like public display of affection without anybody actually knowing that's what it was. So I was kind of thinking about that. Because of kind of my hunting family background, I was also really interested in hair and was researching Victorian mourning jewelry, which often incorporated deceased loved ones' hair. Um, and I kind of wanted to incorporate all of those ideas and match them all up into kind of like a single organism. So I took some furs that I had and started thinking of taxidermy as my way to kind of incorporate the lover's eye and also Victorian mourning jewelry into a single object. And I really think of taxidermy as kind of like a very loose term. I don't think of it as like a traditional, really realistic looking animal, but more so just the arrangement of skin. So some of the work that I was doing in grad school were these. I guess I call them identity brooches. And I was kind of thinking about the bear community. So I myself kind of identify more with the otter on the left-hand side, but one day aspire to hopefully become a bear on the right-hand side. And I think I get a little bit closer every day. Um, 10 years away. Um, And so these are made through chasing and repoussé, which is a forming process. And then they kind of have this juxtaposed bear fur hair, which my partner Everett found for me at a vintage shop in Idaho. And I explored that in a few different ways. I tried dyeing the fur. I tried using copper as well as precious metals such as silver. And I really kind of played around with that for a while before I decided to take the work a little bit deeper. So a lot of my research in grad school actually stemmed from Epiphany in the Wilderness by Karen R. Jones. A lot of my ideas kind of came from that. And essentially, Epiphany in the Wilderness is about how hunting culture and taxidermy, the images and artwork that sort of surrounded westward movement and the politics of all of that sort of influenced the way that we view the 19th century West and therefore kind of contemporary America. So I became really interested in how history kind of reverberates through time and influences the way that we behave today, which I'll kind of revisit later in the presentation. On the right-hand side is Teddy Roosevelt, who was also kind of, for political reasons, a very large proponent of getting back to the wild and kind of reinvigorating the urbanized man to be more masculine, to go on hunting escapades and that sort of thing. And so the connection for me was pretty clear. Some of the artwork that I was looking at are these paintings and photographs of men kind of like conquering the wild and sort of this very theatrical display of what masculinity was supposed to be, and that I think continues into today. And I was also kind of interested in homosocial behavior, sort of like the gayness of it all, of all these men going out into the wilderness to be together, to have this sort of like intimate experience. And I don't think that that's quite acknowledged either in the narrative. So I kind of took a step back from highly representational imagery and focused more on more simplified, abstracted forms. I started to think about the bear fur as kind of this symbol of masculinity. And for this piece specifically, I was thinking about how on the outside, we kind of, or at least I feel pressure to portray myself in a kind of masculine way. And that I sort of code switch into this other persona in certain instances so that I can be accepted or so that I can be without fear of any retribution from people. But on the inside, I was kind of thinking of domestic spaces. So here is an enameled pattern, which is based off of William Morris wallpaper print. And I was kind of thinking about how it reminded me of my grandma's kitchen and kind of like those more domestic spaces where ideas of masculinity are not so prevalent. So it was sort of this duality happening from the front and as well as the back. I took that idea a little bit further with this piece, which I call Frame Reflect. And I started to think about the juxtaposition of the bear fur with the body. In my family home, we have all of these kind of oval framed portraits of different family members scattered throughout the house. And I was kind of thinking of this as sort of like a distorted portrait of myself. So when worn, the highly polished silver rings on the inside of the open frames kind of distort the body and create an inaccurate kind of portrayal of the individual who is wearing it. In Mirror Mirror, I took the idea a little bit further. And I used highly polished silver, which I had chased and formed and altered so that when you look into your reflection in juxtaposition to this sort of like masculine bear fur piece, it's also distorted. It's unrecognizable, which is sort of how I was feeling about my upbringing. And I include this mostly for the jewelry freaks out there because the back of the brooch tends to be just as important as the front of the brooch. And I'm really proud of this setting that I had created. If you're a jewelry person out there, I hope that you enjoy that. And then kind of the last piece that I made in this series, I call Bareback. I was trying to use up the rest of the vintage bear fur that I had. And I wanted to create kind of like a body installation without really having a plan or idea for what that was going to mean or what it might communicate. And when it was finally finished and I documented it on my body, it kind of started to feel like a pox, like this disease. Like when I put on the bear fur, instead of making me look more masculine, it actually made me look like I was ill, which I thought was kind of interesting that it just sort of became that, like subconsciously. Um, but I also am interested in the idea of how objects exist when they're not on the body, and did a few installations in a few different ways with this work. And what I find interesting is that when you put the work into kind of the sterilized white wall gallery space, it loses all of that meaning. It becomes more of an aesthetic object and less of this like loaded image of illness. Um, and then I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit like, how is this relevant to today, right? Why am I talking about 19th century taxidermy when taxidermy is so uncommon? Well, I think the way that furs have been adorned in the past, like with the image of Teddy Roosevelt, are still being used for adornment today in a much different way. It still holds kind of the idea of masculinity, of force over nature, of power. And I think that that became very apparent on January 6th in 2021 with the January 6th shaman who went into the White House and desecrated a lot of different things wearing this headdress. So I think it's something that still needs to be analyzed. I don't think that we're beyond taxidermy and furs and that sort of culture. I think it's still present. And I think that with this work, I kind of wanted to analyze that. I wanted to think about how adornment can sort of be this microscope under which we can examine ideas of masculinity in that material. Um, but with a lot of the things in my practice, I kind of I feel like I kind of culminate, I wrap projects up, and then I'm ready to move on to something different. And often we'll kind of revisit them at a later time. So I sort of turned my attention more towards specifically westward movement. I was looking at stories that I had grown up with in the Mormon church, and kind of their journey out west, from middle America over to what is now Utah. And I was kind of thinking about the narratives that we tell ourselves. I was looking at specimens which were collected during the Lewis and Clark expedition, specifically the animals and the plants that they brought back with them, which were later put into natural history museums and kind of created this overarching narrative of science and a Western vision for what this land meant to white colonizers. And so I was kind of thinking about that, but I was thinking more specifically about how ideas of queerness are not included in that narrative at all. But through documented photographic and literary evidence, homosexual and homosocial interactions occurred quite frequently. There weren't actually that many women in early westward movement who were going with men. And so a lot of the men there were just kind of with each other, kind of discovering things about themselves. There would be dances where men would kind of take on active and passive roles as dance partners. They even had what they called bachelor's marriages, where men would kind of come together in domestic spaces and have unions with each other. And none of this is really explored at all in American history. And on top of that, I think it has to be acknowledged that queerness in the two-spirit people of many different tribes of the United States existed long before any white settlers came to this continent. Um, so it's bizarre to me that that isn't a part of the story at all, that you don't find that in the natural history museums that have specimens from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Um, and so I was thinking about that. I was kind of thinking about all of those different things. I was thinking about the Natural History Museum display and how kind of like hidden underneath that narrative, there are ideas that kind of negate um, any kind of queerness in nature. For instance, in this display, we have kind of this very heterosexual nuclear family structure. We have the mama deer, the baby deer, and the daddy deer. But in reality, daddy deers don't stay around. Mama deers pretty much take care of the babies all by themselves. And yet we're kind of given this vision of a heterosexual, like common sort of like household drama. Like the dad deer is like looking out for predators and stuff like that. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. Um, and I do appreciate the really fine taxidermy. I appreciate the realism of that. But what I love most about taxidermy is when it's really bad. I really enjoy when taxidermy kind of goes wrong. I think because we're sort of meant to be fooled by the narrative. We're supposed to believe that when things are done right and well and good, that it's true. But when it's wrong, it's just wrong. And all of that is disappeared. And so kind of wrapping all of that stuff up into one kind of conjoined object, I created a series of earrings, which I called Manifest. I was combining kind of phallic forms with animal parts and then fabricated metal components that referenced different plants that had been collected during the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I came up with a variety of forms. Now, earrings hold a really special place for me because in the Mormon tradition, men are not really allowed to adorn themselves, and they're especially not allowed to have any piercings of any kind. And I grew up in the 90s with like NSYNC and like all of these really cool guys that had earrings and stuff. And so like maybe that was like a precursor to me realizing that I was gay, but at the time I was just like, I want to do that, have my ears pierced. So by making this work, I'm also kind of like, I'm thinking about that as well, how like the smaller things that I do for myself, such as having piercings and adorning myself with things that don't align with the church, are sort of like my way of owning my autonomy in a way. So I made, I think I made about 10 or something pairs of earrings. And I wanted to display them using materials which are often used in natural history museums. So I created these plexiglass and steel display cases. I frosted each of them so that the viewer was forced to look through kind of like a glory hole, and then displayed them at about knee height so that the only way to really view them was to put your body in more of a passive bent over position. And in that way, I kind of hoped that I would make the viewer sort of have this queer experience to view the work and enjoy it. But while I was in grad school, I was also encouraged to not give up on my sculpture practice. I went to grad school and I was like, I'm committed. I'm just a jeweler now. I don't make sculpture anymore. And they were like, why? Maybe you should consider making sculpture. And I fought with myself for the first year or so, and then decided that I would just pursue that and see what happened. So part of my thesis was the Manifest series, but it was also the Touching Trophy series. So with this work, I was carving basswood. The idea behind it was that I was kind of doing the same thing with the earrings. I was combining floral forms and animal skins together into these kind of abstracted phallic objects. And what I wanted to do was sort of undermine like museum protocols, right? Like when you go to a museum, you're not supposed to touch the work. You're encouraged to, or specifically told not to do that because it does damage the artwork over time. The acids and the oils in your fingers will do that. But what I wanted to do was to encourage people to do that by creating these really voluptuous and textural forms using carved surfaces and animal furs and stuff like that. And I had hoped that people would kind of touch them and leave their fingerprints and their dirt and like kind of indicate this sort of intimate reaction or relationship between themselves and the objects. Um, but I guess maybe a failure of this project was that people were still afraid to do that unless I specifically gave them permission to do it. So despite like creating these tantalizing forms, I didn't actually really achieve what I had hoped. But it's, that's the artistic practice. You have to just sort of keep working through things and try to figure things out, make mistakes, and then try again. um Now, when I was in school, a lot of my faculty were like, what are these forms referencing? Like, what is this about? And I work very intuitively and kind of come to the ideas later. um but as far as I can tell, based off of the artwork that my mom sent me a few months ago, it probably came from this jacked gargoyle guy that I drew when I was like 10 years old. I think there's a lot of similarities between his abdomen and also the hunting trophies that I made in that series. Um, so after I graduated, received my MFA, I was very lucky to get a job at Virginia Commonwealth University, teaching in the metals department, and had some really excellent students. They were making really good work, and I was like, I'm an excellent teacher. And I've made it. I'm finally over all of those hurdles. Like, I'm just going to be an artist now and I have an art career. Excellent. Um, but then the bills came again. Adjuncting doesn't pay as much as we all hope it would. And I once again found myself needing extra work and turned back again to making coffee. But I think the thing that I kind of learned from doing all of that was that it's okay to work at a coffee shop. I made probably more money there than I do at most teaching jobs I've had. And I didn't have to take things home with me, and I didn't have to grade projects either, which was great. So, it's like, it feels like a step back sometimes, but also it's kind of a step forward in a lot of different ways. Um, while I was doing all of that stuff, my partner and I started our curatorial project, which we call Spectral Matter. It is a queer exhibition platform that we try to hold every 2 years, although it's been a little more than 2 years since the last time we did it. And basically, we invite different craft artists in all kinds of media. We invite metalsmiths, woodworkers, textile artists, as long as it's craft based and the artists are queer, um, they can be invited. And our first exhibition was called Slippery and Subversive. We were kind of thinking of using craft as this subversive means to communicate queerness. And I think that we had a really good show. We installed it at the East Carolina University Material Topics Symposium, actually in 2020, right before the pandemic. And we got a lot of really great submissions for that project. We had our second iteration in 2022, I think it was. And that traveled from Gallery 2052 to Almost Gallery, and then finally culminated at the Penland Gallery. And the thing that I think I really get from doing the curatorial work that's really enriching for me is that I get to build relationships with other artists. I get to have all these people trust me with their work and trust me to create an exhibition for them to kind of create a whole new meaning through our combined work all together in one space. And I think that's a really beautiful and powerful thing. I really enjoy, as an artist, being able to do that kind of work. And then on the other side of things, I also get to build relationships with galleries. So galleries also trust me to do a good job and to make their gallery look good and to select artists that are going to produce good work. And so I get a lot of enrichment out of that. I really enjoy it. And here are a couple of more images from that. So I took a bit of a break before I really made any serious work. After grad school, I was teaching a lot, really focusing on making money. And in late 2020, I got my Baltimore Jewelry Center residency. And so that was like my first foray back into a new body of work. And what I had hoped I would do was sort of get away from the things that I had done in grad school and kind of like turn a corner and do something a little bit new. And I was really trying to channel this kind of energy where I made this really messed up six-legged dog and this like fish thing in the lower right-hand corner. I was like, let's get back to that childlike sense of wonder. Um, but of course, I kind of went back to the more traditional wood carving and metalsmithing skills that I possessed. And so this I call my Orifice series. Um, and I thought at first while I was making it that I was really doing something very different than my grad school work. And I think visually it is very different. I was kind of thinking about the body, and I was thinking about feathers and fur and different ways of trying to represent that through wood carving. Um, but in the end, I kind of found myself realizing that what I was doing was creating this, again, juxtaposition between animal furs and the natural environment and sort of like imagery of that with the body. I was still kind of thinking about the same thing, but maybe sort of thinking less about my Mormon upbringing and less about that specific story that I was dealing with. Um, but that kind of those building blocks were still sort of there. Um, Formerly, some of the things that I was thinking about were like navels or like a mouth, or as my friend Corey Pemberton said, girl, that looks like a prolapse anus. And he's not wrong. But I kind of like that in between space that these sort of abstracted organic forms can be anything, that it sort of stirs up maybe some discomfort in the viewer as it is juxtaposed to these really, beautifully crafted wooden forms. And the metal itself is also very carefully and beautifully crafted as well. So even though it has sort of that off-putting maybe vibe, it also is inviting in other ways. Because I guess my goal is to kind of um, invite people to feel more comfortable with the uncomfortable parts of themselves in a way. Um, so I was making that series at the Baltimore Jewelry Center. I carried that over and finished it at Penland School of Crafts when I became a resident artist in late 2020. And while I was at Penland, oh, just a side note, I forgot about this slide. Penland is amazing. I've never been to a place where I would meet a crawdad friend on my way to the studio, and then the very same day when I'm gardening, meet another friend, a little salamander friend, all at once. Like that's the type of place that Penland is. There's no place like it. Everybody should go there. It's amazing. Um, but so anyways, while I was there, um, I kind of started to focus on being an artist that is a business. That was something that I had never really been trained for. I'd never really thought of artwork as a way to make money. But being at Penland sort of allowed me to experiment with that. I had sort of this ready-made clientele with all of the people who came through my studio, and I had really great conversations with them, and I grew a lot from that. And I also was able to make some sales, which was very new to me. And so I was kind of experimenting with different ways that I could do that and trying limited production series. This I call my Furry Friend series. And my first attempt at doing this was to kind of make a body of work, which were like these little carved furry guys that you could wear on your body. Um, and I'd hoped that, like these tantalizing forms would draw people in and I can charge an appropriate price for them. Um, but it's trickier than that. Like when people are buying jewelry, they tend to expect that the price that they're paying is a reflection of the material itself often and not necessarily the artistry that goes into it. And so I was able to get these out the door and they're all in some collections somewhere, but it took a really long time to make them and it took a really long time to sell them. So I was like, that's not going to work. Like maybe I should try a different avenue and go back to doing maybe a little more research with some of this like very wearable work. And I kind of came across the Paul Bunyan stories. With Paul Bunyan, I was really interested in his origin story. He was this really influential kind of like American mythological figure at the beginning of the 20th century. uh the story of Paul Bunyan was developed actually by a bunch of illiterate loggers who just kind of like started to tell this story of this massive man and his big blue ox that would go and like decimate the landscape for wood, which is not great. But um like it was sort of like they were creating this figure that they looked up to, that they aspired to be like. So he is this sort of symbol of masculinity that faded away. You rarely ever see Paul Bunyan except for maybe like as a roadside attraction, in rural Virginia or wherever. That's where I've seen him. Um, and so I kind of became interested in that story because of that, and about how masculinity changes over time. And so I did a series of earrings that I called Pieces of Blue. Um, and this was kind of like a limited production series. I didn't make a whole lot of these, and I didn't repeat very many of them. Um, but it was more specific, and I was thinking more specifically about the ideas behind them, which kind of like fulfilled my creative needs on top of making a really covetable object that could be worn. And sort of as an offshoot of that, I was really interested in the color blue. I was thinking about Babe the Blue Ox, and if I were to split it up into a bunch of different pieces, like what it might look like. And I made additional jewelry work as well as sculpture work. Um, and so there were a lot of different pieces that I made in this series, but something that I wanted to experiment with while I was at Penland, in addition to making very sellable items, was also creating larger sculptural works. So this is one of the largest pieces that I've made. I think it's about 2.5 feet high by about 12 feet wide, all hand carved. And it took me a really long time, but it was really fun to make. I call it a snake in the garden. I was kind of thinking of like religious stories and like this abstracted hairy snake guy sort of form, and how it could kind of poke fun at that narrative. Um, and I kind of jump back and forth between the sculpture work and then making um, more like one of a kind jewelry pieces. So I was trying a lot to work on the woodwork. I was trying to find ways that I could make carved wood elevated. So on the left-hand side, for that pair of earrings, I kind of carved these cabochons out of maple, and I painted them, and I was like, these are sculptural, but they're also kind of like gems. The thing that I love about wood jewelry is that you can work very large, and because it's really lightweight, it's not going to like drag the ears down or be uncomfortable to wear. So I was kind of experimenting with scale and how big I could go with the work. Um, but what I kind of came to the conclusion of was that the best way for me to create a reproducible production line that wasn't going to drain me of all of my creative energy, and that people could access, was sort of simplifying things. So I ended up, for probably about the last 2 years of my residency, focusing a lot on my shadow collection. And with this work, I was kind of focusing on portals and the circle form and the oval form and openings as sort of like a grounding design pivot point, and then seeing how many different ways that I could make objects that use those sort of forms. Um, and I really wanted this to, feel significant to me outside of just being a way to sell things. And so something that I was also thinking about was like, how do I give up control? A lot of the things that I do require hand precision and a lot of skill and a lot of time. And so when I was designing these, I decided to use my non-dominant hand to create the portals and to create the forms, and then use my dominant hand after creating these kind of imperfect designs to then transfer into silver and other types of materials. So I made a lot of that work, experimented a lot, and tried a lot of different techniques, and it worked pretty well. I felt pretty good about the production that I had created. I sent a lot of it out. I had a lot of sales at Penland, which was nice. Um, but I realized that making production work doesn't necessarily feed me. It doesn't always make me feel creatively fulfilled. Um, so I tried my best to focus on additional work outside of madly producing production. I turned back to chasing and repose, which I hadn't done for a while. And this is kind of a more recent body of work, which for right now I'm calling my Hairy Ghost series. And a lot of the work I had made before was like, I was thinking very deeply about these heavy concepts and like the like political representation of the West and like all that kind of stuff. And with this work, I wanted to kind of simplify and really focus on queerness and the idea of queer joy and like queer protection and like what could these really kind of sly little guys do for me when they were being worn. Um, so I made them in a variety of different materials. Um, this guy I call Golden Boy. This one is Doppelganger 1, which I made out of sterling silver. And this is Doppelganger 2, which is kind of the mirror opposite of the first Doppelganger. Something I was thinking about was using materials that I had never used before for this process. Chasing a repose is really time consuming, and there are some risks involved of breaking the metal and ruining your piece. And I wanted to see if I could do it in steel as well as silver as well as brass, and that's been very exciting to me, like experimenting with different materials that I'm unfamiliar with. So I was kind of experimenting with that, and again thinking about the back of the piece, like how can I communicate that joy in some sort of way. I did not abandon making one of a kind wood jewelry. This is my pairs series. With this, again, I was kind of thinking of some technical challenges and visual relationships. So I made wooden chains. Something that was very exciting for me was discovering that I could use clothespins as a clamp to get the chain to kind of stick together when I had split each individual part and then rejoined them. Um, and with that work, I was kind of thinking about like the relationship between different parts, like how different parts can kind of influence or affect each other in the same way that history affects us today. So while I'm still kind of thinking of those deeper concepts, I'm doing it in a way that is maybe more accessible and a little more palatable for a general audience. This is some of the work being worn. Um, and then while I was doing all of that work, I was also I'd also started my decoy series. So this is actually the first piece and the only piece that I've made in this body of work. But for the decoy series, I was kind of thinking about hunting again and turning back to the decoy object as sort of this tool for tricking animals into feeling comfort and to sort of placing themselves into the sniper's rifle or whatever. Um, and so I was kind of thinking about that and like relating that to my experience growing up as a queer person in a really restrictive environment. Um, and so for this series, I'm still kind of processing it and like breaking it down. And I have a bunch of pieces which are started, but I have to get back to at some point in time. But for this work, I was kind of thinking of how I could create a queer decoy in some sort of way. So this was the result for the first iteration of that. It's a double-headed goose, which is also sort of like a snake. Um, I was kind of turning back to my interest in bad taxidermy and like thinking about how I could create sort of like a decoy which does not trick the viewer, that is a decoy but is not actually meant to fool anybody, and sort of draw attention to those kinds of ideas, I guess. Um, and all of that, all of the woodwork and everything else that I had done over the last several years, is sort of what led me to today, to seeking out the residency through the Museum for Art and Wood and NextFab to create this body of work. And so what I have decided to do with my time with this residency is focus on creating a series of brushes using furs, which I inherited from my dad, who died in 2011. So when he passed away, I received a bunch of different pelts of his, coyote and fox. I have bones and antlers and all kinds of different things that I was given permission to alter and use as material for art projects. This is my dad with one of his horses and one of my nieces from when he was alive. And what I wanted to do for this residency is to carve all of the handles using repurposed wood. Uh, Most, if not maybe just two or three of the pieces came from smaller chunks of wood, which were given up in different wood shops from friends of mine and acquaintances. Because most woodworkers are furniture makers, and most furniture makers need very large pieces of wood to make their work. And I need very small pieces of wood to do the things that I love to do. So it allowed me to kind of take these things that would have been tossed or put into the burn pile or whatever and turn them into something that is meaningful and useful and tells a story. Um, so that was kind of my pitch to the museum, and they let me in to do this project. And this project has been really fun. My goal was to fill up as much of a wall as I could. Originally, I thought I would do 50 pieces so I could have like this big grid of brushes, and realized very quickly that I am delusional and that can't be done in 2 months for me. But I think, what I ended up with, I still feel really good about. Each of these forms I approached very intuitively. I was kind of just thinking of ways that I could experiment with the brush form kind of sculpturally while still allowing it to maybe have the possibility of use. And a lot like all of the other processes that I use in my work, everything I do takes a very long time. And for a while, a lot like how my artistic path has been, things are kind of bumpy and lumpy and like cubes and like ugly. And it takes a very long time for everything to come together, but eventually you end up with something that feels finished, and it's like this culmination of all of these different experiences that you've had that ends up becoming, this new object or this new stage of your career. And so these are for the Zoom people. You can't see the wall over here, but I took some quick pictures with my phone of the finished work. Originally, this was a very good learning experience for me in brush making, to realize that what I wanted to do was use all of my dad's coyote fur and his fox fur, but learning that you can't really make very large fiber bundles with that type of fur. So a few of these do use his animal hides. A lot of them I ended up using furs, which I already had, and then purchasing some horsehair that kind of like reminded me of the horses that he owned. But despite not being able to use all of the fur from my dad, something that I realized was that I'm, still connecting with him through the creation of these objects. When I was growing up, my family was very poor, and we couldn't afford to do kind of like ordinary things like go to the barber and stuff like that. And so my dad actually cut my own hair, which I guess I kind of like forgot about, or I don't really actively think about. And as I was making all of these, I was trimming them and just like really caring for the shape of them, and like kind of giving these bundles of fiber little haircuts. And it really reminded me of of that experience of like connecting with my dad over this ordinary, mundane kind of task. So despite not being able to use my dad's animal hides, I still feel like I've got that connection despite all of that. So this has been really exciting for me. I can't wait to make more brushes and to continue being all over the map and trying out different things and making jewelry and making sculpture. That's all I have for you tonight for my artist talk. There's my dog Clementine. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for you now. You can also follow me on Instagram. I would love that.
Does anybody have any questions? No one?
Hi, Adam.
Hey.
There's a lot of varying scale in the work that you've made during this residency, but that all very jewelry, and particularly those small pieces. Are you going to sort of continue with this mode in your jewelry practice? Like, what do you think is coming next for you?
Yeah, that's a great question and very intuitive. I am thinking about that after making this work. Something that I guess bothers me about my practice is that I have so many varied interests and have yet to find a way to combine them together into like a cohesive, I guess we could say marketable like practice. I think that's fine to say. And so I would like to kind of experiment with combinations of things that I do in metal and some of these kind of like wooden brush forms, or even, you know, just like smaller carved objects that could get put into metal components. Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad that you thought about that. I am thinking about that too.
I think all you need is a little piece of cord, and they're already pendants.
That I could do that. That's true. I could keep it simple. It's really hard for me.
Yeah, we were actually talking about that in your studio visit. Anybody else? Colin?
Hey, Adam. I was just wondering, it seemed like in the beginning of the talk, you were talking about like declaring being a sculptor and then going back to being a jeweler. I was wondering where you landed on that. If it's, are you both? Does it matter if you're either? I was just wondering.
I'm really fluid like that now. Yeah. I feel like I'm both. I think that the conclusion that I came to is that maybe the idea is more important to me. And I kind of like that I do have, maybe I'm a more established sculpture practice now, because I think that in jewelry a lot of the time you get like wrapped up and like I'm a jeweler and all of my ideas need to be wearable. But for me, I can choose, you know, with the practice that I've established for myself to make sculpture if the idea doesn't need for it to be wearable. So that's something that I think has been a big benefit for deciding that I would be both, I guess.
Oh, this way. I'm playing Phil Donahue right now. For those that are old enough.
Hi.
Hey.
I really appreciated how you sprinkled in how you support yourself throughout your trajectory of your career. What are you doing to support yourself now?
I am teaching mostly as a way to make income. I've taken a step back from making the shadow collection work, so that I can focus on more one-of-a-kind things. And I teach at Tyler in the metals department, and I also teaching at the Baltimore Jewelry Center once or twice a week there. So, but it's great. It's kind of those things align with my goals as well. Like it's community driven work. Yeah.
This is more of a technique question, but how do you get such a perfect curve on the heads of the brushes. Is that just like giving it a haircut, like you said, just very carefully, like working it down till it's perfect?
Yeah.
Because that looks kind of impossible.
I kind of start off with really sharp scissors, and I actually go in with like buzz cutters and will remove material that way, which is it's a really like flat cutting surface, so that allows me to get really broad sweeps across and smooth things out. Yeah.
It's a little of a bit of an inchoate thought, but I'm thinking about the conversations that we've had in the past about queer identity, object making, and wood in particular.
Mhm.
But Sarah Ahmed writes about happy objects, and which are, you know, meant to serve us and surround us and bring us happiness. And your talk just now reminded me of some things that I was thinking about when I was actually working as a curator at Bellevue Arts Museum, about objects and how they're meant to perform, and the potential of assumed performance, and then when they don't deliver on that, or they come around and subvert that assumption and perform in different ways. Could you talk a little bit about how your objects, I mean, they really seem to illustrate a lot of the things I was thinking then and also now, with conversations like the one we're going to have tomorrow about queering woodcraft. Could you talk a little bit about how your objects perform?
Yeah. You know, like I kind of mentioned in the talk, I was thinking about the brush as a sculptural format. And for many of these brushes, for some of them, they would be used in the way you expect them to be used. Some of them are very approachable in that way. They could be used to, you know, put on glaze to a pot or whatever. For others, I'm thinking more about the form itself and the way that the viewer or holder of the object is kind of put into this position to sort of like figure out how they interact with the object. And so for many of them, especially with the ones with the larger loops, and the handles that are a little bit more sculptural, it requires the viewer to kind of maybe approach it in a different way, to kind of like have a sense of playfulness or experimentation in the way that they think the brush might be used, because it's not quite so obvious. I kind of imagine, and something that I sort of maybe dream of doing eventually, is like trying to use them in more of a performative manner so that I myself can like demonstrate that these objects are meant to be playful, and to experiment with the ways that each of them make a mark, because many of them are not really they don't allow you to like have control over them as you would expect a brush to sort of like provide for you. Yeah, so I guess in that way, like that's sort of what I was thinking about in terms of their utility and their function and use. It's not meant to be clear, and I think that that's really queer. Like it's ambiguous and it's not certain. Yeah.
I don't have a question, Adam, but I do want to thank you for being here for the last 2 months. I want to thank you for putting in all the ambitious work. Even though the wall's not filled, it is certainly it's still an ambitious show. It's filled. Maybe not to your original vision of filled, but it's an impressive showing. And I also love that you are open to sharing the templates that are on the glass piece that are just to the right there. Being in this space, it's not a gallery. I loved hearing you talk about, you know, navigating gallery spaces and museum spaces and what those kind of stiff parameters have. And, you know, this is not a gallery, obviously, and it is a space where people come to learn and be inspired. And I'm really grateful for you spending time with us over the last 2 months and sharing those templates and being willing to share that process more with folks here. It's inspiring. I'm glad to see some of our members out here tonight, getting to see the work and hear more about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a real joy. I really appreciate it. All right. Thanks for coming out, everybody.